And Avi, as you're the guy we haven't heard from yet, I'm going to start with you. What we've had in different ways from the point of view of a shipbuilder and a cruise line CEO, and from Michael with his academic research hat on, we've heard about a changing Arctic, and an Arctic which shipping is using more and more. So from the point of view of your administration and maritime safety, what are you seeing out there, and how easy is it to manage change?
Yeah, we definitely see that change happening. We see it in fisheries moving north. We see it in the last year. It's been a dramatic increase in the number of tons of petroleum products that sails outside this coast from the northern Norway and Russia. And we see it at Svalbard, our Arctic area, where we see more cruise tourism. So it's definitely a change that we are seeing and trying to cope with, so to speak.
And interesting, you mentioned Svalbard. Am I right in saying over the last week you've had a bit of a nightmare with a vessel that's stuck in Svalbard, run aground?
Yeah, it was December 28th. We had a fishing trawler that ran aground during his operation of trawling quite far north, close to 80 degrees. At Hinlopen Strait.
That's pretty far north. Is it still run aground? It's still
there?
Yeah,
the wreck is still there, but it has now been completely emptied of all hazardous, like both the fuel and hydraulic oil and things like that.
But I guess that's a salutary sort of lesson or point, really, for everybody on this panel and in this audience to take away with them, that however much we talk about warming and easier access and new routes opening up, even, as Michael says, in the easy part of the Arctic waterways, which is around Norway, you know, you can get taken by surprise, bad weather, ice, everything else. It's not easy out there.
Yeah, and I perfectly agree with what Michael said. It is a different Arctic than what he knows from the north of Canada. However, if you look at this particular incident, when it happened, the ice was sort of closing in from the north. So when the Coast Guard vessel 6 days later rounded, it really needed to have the ice class it had in order to get to this. So it was, and in addition, the salvage operation of the personnel was very dramatic, very small margins.
I mean, do you think some skippers and some companies, whether they be fishing businesses or indeed leisure and cruise operators, are beginning to get a little bit complacent about the Arctic waters?
But I think that's hard for me to say. But I think
no, it's not. If you feel it, just come out and say it. Feel free. We're all friends here. You can say whatever you like.
What's important to me is that the operators, they really need to do the risk assessment of the operation they are doing, and that varies from place to place. And I'm very impressed with what Hurtigruten has done with greening the fleet. I'm more concerned about what Daniel is saying about balancing the seasons.
Right.
That means using more of the shoulder seasons.
Where the risk factors are much higher.
Other risk factors, at least. So you need to take that into account when planning the operations. And also the fact that, like at Svalbard, there are quite a lot of ships in that size in the most hectic period in July, August, September. In the shoulder season, it's scarcer, meaning that the help is also longer away.
Right.
So it's a balance you need to
It's a very interesting point, and Daniel, you need to address it right now. I mean, you characterize your commitment to extending the sailing season as some sort of environmental good because it sort of dissipates the concentration of tourists at any one time, and you're saying that it makes it easier for communities to cope. But frankly, you're dressing up what is a business decision. You want to maximize the revenues that you get over as long a period of the year as you can to make the most efficient use of your capital investment. And it's dangerous, it's risky.
No, not at all. And I think we need to differentiate what areas we're speaking about. The Arctic is quite large. The Arctic is not only Svalbard. We are speaking about quite large areas where there's people living. And we as an industry, we need to make sure that we're not only giving a livelihood to people who is flying in for the summer season from elsewhere in the world. We need to make sure that the ones who is working in the tourism industry, in the places along the Norwegian coast, in Canada, in the small communities on Greenland actually have something to live from the rest of the year as well. And this is not about sending ships into Svalbard in January, because it's not a cruise product. Hurtigruten has a land-based product during those months. And we combine the cruise-based product with the land-based product during the summer months. So this is about value creation, not having a lot of cruise ships going to Svalbard in January.
So when you talk about extending the season, literally, if we're talking
It's
about
value
destinations like Svalbard, what period are you prepared to sail up there?
So what we are doing, we are the largest operator also in Antarctica. And we as an industry have a very, part of the industry has a very big interest in making sure our operation is as safe as possible in these areas. Which means that when we are extending the season in Antarctica, we have discussion now about making sure there are more ships in the area at the same time to make sure that you can have help. IECO, which we are a member of, a founding member of, we have a tracking system between all the ships who's a member of IECO, where we can make sure that we can get help and assistance in these areas. It's the ones who is not a member of IECO, who is not following the procedures and the training we set in place to operate in these tough areas, which is the problem. Not the ones who is following all the training that is demanded. When we are doing landings on Svalbard, we are making safety assessments, we are making sustainability assessments with scientists before we do landings.
What size are your vessels in terms of passenger numbers?
It depends. It's between 100 and 500 people on board.
So you could have up to, 500 people marching into Svalbard, could you, off one of your vessels?
What we do is we don't disembark all the guests at the same time. For instance, Antarctica, you're not allowed to bring more than 100 guests to land at the same time.
Right.
So you have to do it in groups. The big challenge is if you have a 5,000 bed ship who is coming into Longyearbyen with a 2,000 man-member crew into a community with 1,900 people, and everyone is disembarking at the same time. That's overcrowding.
Agreed, but you're couching the argument as though you're completely different and you're absolving yourself from any connection with that overwhelming and possibly very negative experience within the travel sector. But it seems to me you're not entirely disconnected from that. Even if you're having several hundred people go at once to pretty much a pristine and very scarcely populated area, you threaten to upset the environmental balance of that place.
I beg to differ on that, because it's always a discussion, what is too much people? So what you have to do is you have to approach this in a scientific way, which is the reason why we are bringing scientists to all our landing sites to make an evaluation about how many people can you bring here. When can you not bring people at all because the animal life is there? When is it not a threat to animal life? And what's the impact since last time we made the analysis? And this is not only Hurtigruten, it's a lot of other operators who also is part of this.
Yeah,
but this is an analytical way of operating in a sustainable way. And we are not saying we should ban tourism, because sustainable tourism is a very good livelihood for a lot of people.
You did begin by saying that you work in a dirty business. So, you're in that business and there's dirtiness involved, however clean you say your hands are, but it just clearly is.
And if you argue that way, you could say all industries are dirty in some way because you use energy. So it's about creating livelihoods. It's about making sure that we can live of it, not the next 10 years, but the next 150, 200 years.
It's a really interesting debate, and the ethics of it are fascinating, and I do want to come back to them, but I actually want to move on for now, and then we'll come back. Michael, you seem to be wanting to say something. When I was referring to whether there was any sense of perhaps higher risk thresholds, maybe even complacency coming into our discussion of shipping in the Arctic waters. What's your take on that?
I don't think that most people understand just how dangerous the North American and Russian Arctics are. In the last 8 years, I've lost 4 colleagues in accidents in the Arctic.
Really?
We could have lost 200 people on a cruise ship last summer. It went on to rocks, but fortunately the weather was good and rescue was able to arrive before the weather became bad. We had a similar incident in 2010. We could have lost 200 people then. Both those cruise ship accidents were because the captain was going into new places because his customers wanted to explore. So the government response to that has to be to close off places where the charts are poor or where there are other challenges. We have to be able to limit access for safety reasons. But the other thing to remember, even when we're talking about cruise ships, is that a big cruise ship, a Disney or a Costa, will have 1 million liters of fuel oil on board, right? So you don't need to have an oil tanker to have an oil spill. And so, in a future scenario where one of these non-Arctic cruise lines decides to send a 3,000 or 4,000 passenger ship through the Northwest Passage, we've got a massive environmental risk. And people need to think about that when they think about these abstract legal disputes about the status of these waterways. The reason why Canada considers the Northwest Passage to be Canadian internal waters is because we need the environmental protection jurisdiction to protect the environment and to protect the Indigenous people who live there. It's not about power, it's about environmental protection.
Okay, well, that's a great point too, and I might well come back to that and the geopolitics of this. But I want to bring you in, Aziz, because I want to get a clearer picture of who your customers are. You say you're building a lot of ice-capable vessels now, more than ever before. Who's buying them? What are they being used for?
Okay, so basically for our ice class vessels or icebreakers, we built it for Finnish customers, Swedish and Norwegian basically, who operate tankers or even for cruise vessels when you need to navigate from difficult conditions basically.
Right, you don't have Chinese clients who are...
No, we don't have Chinese clients.
No, okay. But in your view, is this a business, and therefore is your business going to thrive? Are more and more people looking to invest in ice-capable, I don't know if that's the phrase that you're using, but ice-capable ships?
Okay, so over the years, in fact, we started to build the first 2 icebreaker. That was in 2007, and that was for a Russian customer, Lukoil, basically. And since then, basically, we are getting a lot of inquiries. We're getting quite a number of orders. And recently, we basically built an LNG ice strengthened vessel, and basically, it's basically to service the Arctic market, where what was mentioned just now regarding vessels that will basically migrate using marine diesel oil to gas fuel vessels basically, and you need from time to time to bunker these vessels basically, so that if an accident does happen, the impact to the environment will be far less than if it happens with marine diesel oil.
I see. But the bunkering takes place where?
The bunkering can be basically between the vessel to vessel.
Okay, all right. Another thing that struck me about what you said was you want to build, I think, unless I'm misreading you, you want to build some sort of floating tourist hub in the middle of the Arctic Ocean.
So this is something that we have been trying to market since, for the last 1-2 years. And what we are trying to say is that if you have passenger vessels visiting the Arctic cities basically, and then as what you have mentioned just now, that it can basically impact the livelihood of the Arctic people. So one way is to have an Arctic floating city that is away from the coastline, where tourists do come to the Arctic. They basically enjoy the Arctic, basically the surrounding, without visiting on shore basically. At the same time, what will happen is that you have passenger vessels visiting these Arctic floating hubs, okay? And it basically can create good jobs for the Arctic communities over here.
Why on earth should we be servicing this demand of certain numbers of tourists to visit the most remote, pristine, unspoiled parts of the Arctic North? Wouldn't it be better just to keep some parts of this planet off limits to tourism? Why are you so keen to open all these areas up?
So if you take from an Asian perspective, you see that when I talk to my friends and everything, nowadays people want new challenges basically. They want to visit new areas. They do not want to go to Asian countries. They want to go to areas to explore where has not been explored before. Like we go for space tourism.
It was not really exploring, is it? It's going on a cruise boat. It's turning something which is completely remote and unattainable into something that just becomes another cruise experience where you wear your leisure suit and watch movies in your cabin and then come to some floating city in the middle of the... It seems very antithetical to everything that the Arctic, to many of us is about. and I just don't see why you would create that need. You know, it's not necessarily a need that's very much out there, but you see a commercial reason and a profit to be made from it.
No, I don't think so. We see as a profit to be made, but we see the aspiration of people today. What we see is that whether...
I mean, there are lots of things people want which we shouldn't necessarily give them. Anyway, you're in this business, so let's get your take on this.
I think we have to invite you on board one of these expedition ships to actually see how that product is, because the expedition cruise industry it's about, you know, taking care and giving learnings to the guests about the areas that we're in, about immersing in the Arctic culture. And Hurtigruten started the first cruise to Svalbard in 1896. So we've been doing cruises, expedition cruises, to this area for 125 years soon. And
I dare say there weren't 500 people on your first trip in 1890.
I wasn't too much away from that. There was a couple of hundred. So it's been there. The important thing is to do it in a sustainable way. And what we see with our guests there is we create climate ambassadors, because you see the effects of climate change.
I can see this
early.
on your brochure already. We are creating climate ambassadors.
In the Arctic.
It just trips off your tongue, but is it?
Okay, but I have to invite you on board.
Thank you very much.
We are doing lectures about this to our guests, and people are coming back to where they come from, and they are actually changing the way they live based on this. So it's about if you just block all form of tourism to these areas, first of all, you're taking away the livelihood from a lot of people. Second, you are not doing the teaching, but it needs to be organized and it needs to be done in a safe way.
Are we collectively buying this?
Could I just suggest that if you want a true Arctic experience, hire an Inuit guide in a small northern Canadian community to take you out to the ice edge in the early spring, to sleep in an igloo, to be with the polar bears and with the walrus and with the bowhead whales. Spend a week. Leave money behind. Don't drink your fine wine and look out of the windows of your cruise ship between the different visits to the jacuzzi. I mean, if you're going to have an Arctic experience, get cold.
Let's just take a quick straw poll. And it's easy to sort of have a laugh about what you're saying, but you're a very successful businessman. It is working for you. The question is it working for the Arctic? Who believes, alongside Daniel, that when people sign up for his cruises on his, what he would say, are very clean vessels, a clean experience, who believes that they truly are indulging in an experience that turns them into global climate ambassadors? Who believes that? Well, half a hand. Oh, no, actually, I'd say about between 5 and 10% of our audience actually buy that.
Well, it depends on how you phrase it, and when you phrase it that way, of course, you don't get a lot of support for it. But I would love to invite you to see this.
Yeah.
Because I think the way you're presenting it now, I think you're putting the entire Arctic tourism industry who's been in this place, you are making that a laughingstock. And it's not a laughingstock. These are serious people. It's not only our company. It's a lot of very serious operators in the Arctic who
I think you're a serious. I don't doubt
success over decades, delivering fantastic products from the Inuits in Canada to the Greenlanders, who are very proud of delivering a sophisticated product. I don't think this needs to be a discussion that makes this into a laughingstock. This is a very serious business.
I agree, but it's about scale and volume and impact. And what Michael just painted a vision of what might be an alternative visitor experience in the Arctic, obviously much smaller scale, and I dare say more expensive, because the degree to which you reduce scale obviously raises costs to a certain extent. But what do you say to his vision, which is much smaller scale, would have a much lower throughput of tourists through the Arctic, but would be, in many people's eyes, a much truer experience and adventure in terms of what the Arctic really is, and also in terms of the impact it's going to have on the environment?
Well, we are not an advocate for mass tourism in the Arctic. The opposite. We are an advocate for small-scale tourism in the Arctic. And we're an advocate for sustainable tourism in the Arctic, which is why we don't fuel our ships with heavy fuel oil. So if you should, really go after someone, you should go after the big cruise ships with 50,000
Oh,
tons
believe me, if
of
one
heavy
of them
fuel
was
oil in
sitting
them.
here, I would be going
And
after
bringing 7,000 people in.
Yeah.
The expedition cruise industry, the members of IECO, the members of IATO in the Arctic, is a very serious business. We take this seriously, and we've been in the industry for
No,
decades.
and I want to go on to talk about some of the technologies you're using, because they're very interesting. You're talking about battery-powered ships, you're talking about getting away from fossil fuels altogether. It's fascinating. But I'm actually, because of the tyranny of the clock, I want to make sure we get some questions from our audience. So who would like to ask any of our panel a question on the various different aspects of shipping and sort of transportation in the Arctic? Ma'am, yeah, we'll get the microphone to you.
My name is Jenny Spring.
Put the mic really close to your mouth.
You hear me now?
There we
Yes.
go.
My name is Jenny Spring, and I work at the Norwegian Barents Secretariat. I'm just wondering, how can you, was it Michael? You said that, okay, let's have small-scale tourism in the Arctic. Like, have some people go to an igloo, sleep with a local family, and blah, blah, blah. How can you cover the demand? There's so many people who are like the dream of their life is to travel to Arctic or Antarctic. How can you cover that demand without, for example, the explorer cruise ship industry?
There are less than 40,000 people who live in the territory of Nunavut, which is roughly the size of the European Union. It's their home, it has been for thousands of years. They are the stewards of the land and of the water, and in my view, it should be up to them to decide how many tourists come there, and they should be able to decide on what kind of tourism comes and what is left behind. And the Inuit are central to the Canadian government's position. We actually base our claim on the Northwest Passage, on the centuries, millennia of use and occupancy by the Inuit who lived on the ice, who traveled on the ice and still use it intimately. Some of these communities, 80% of their food comes from wildlife. So pardon me putting this back on you, isn't it arrogant for people from elsewhere in the world to demand a right to enter the homeland of these people, to engage in mass tourism?
Go on, don't worry, the microphone's coming, it's interesting. Go
I
on.
just have to follow up because I am from a small town within the Arctic. It's called Kirkenes, and it would have never been tourism in Kirkenes if it hasn't been for the Hurtigruten company. There wouldn't have been tourism like today. A lot of people now live and work with the tourism industry within or over the whole year, not only seasonal, and that's so important for our local community, and that's thanks to Hurtigruten.
And I have traveled on Hurtigruten, and they are a wonderful company. And everything we've heard about them being small and sustainable is true. But in the Canadian Arctic, our communities are smaller, they are more vulnerable. To have ships with more than 200 passengers begins to impose enormous strains. And our big concern right now, not about the Hurtigrutens of the world, but we had the Crystal Serenity sail through in 2 separate years with more than 1,000 passengers on board. The World is coming this summer, which is a 600-passenger ship. And we're terrified about Disney and Costa. I mean, Costa had an accident on the coast of Italy, right, which is probably one of the safest places in the world, right? We couldn't rescue all those people in the Canadian Arctic. We couldn't clean up the oil spill because the ice is coming back in a month or two, right? And when the oil gets into the ice, it's there forever. So the point here is that the answer for the coast of Norway is different from the answer from the coast of Canada or the coast of Russia or the coast of Greenland. And it's the people who live there who should decide. And this idea that mass tourism can be pushed onto them because we all love the Arctic is a little bit colonial in its attitude.
It's a fascinating debate, and I thank you. Thanks for your contribution and the response. That's really interesting and illuminating.